The flight that changed everything. Maya Henderson stood at the entrance of her apartment, her hand resting on the worn handle of her luggage. She took a deep breath, the familiar sensation of pre-flight jitters filling her chest. This time, though, it wasn't just another business trip. This was personal. Maya's mother was sick, gravely so, and Maya hadn't spoken to her in years. The weight of their estranged relationship hung heavy in the air, filling the small apartment with a sense of unfinished business. She stared down at the frayed edges of the suitcase, thinking back to the countless work trips she had taken as an FBI agent. Each trip had been a mission, a purpose to fulfill, but this time the mission wasn't about work, it was about family. Maya wasn't just returning home to visit her mother. She was returning to confront the years of tension that had pushed them apart. The idea of seeing her mother on her deathbed, knowing they might never reconcile, left a tight knot in her stomach. Maya's mother had never understood her career choice. The FBI. She had said, disbelief filling her voice when Maya first announced her decision. How can you work for the very system that oppresses our people? Those words still echoed in Maya's mind, as sharp as the day they were spoken. They had fought endlessly over it. Maya had tried to explain that change could come from within, that she could make a difference in law enforcement, but her mother had refused to see it that way. To her mother, Maya's decision was a betrayal, a rejection of their community, their values. The last time they spoke, the argument had been fierce. "You're turning your back on us, Maya," her mother had said. "You're turning your back on everything we believe in." Maya had walked away from that conversation feeling shattered, but determined. She had excelled in her career, earning commendations and promotions, yet every achievement felt hollow without her mother's approval. Now, as she zipped up her suitcase, the reality of her mother's illness hit her like a freight train. Time was running out, and Maya didn't know if they would ever have the chance to heal the wounds between them. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A message from her brother, Chris. "Mom doesn't have much time left. You need to get here." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Maya gripped the phone tightly, her hand trembling. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. She knew she couldn't put it off any longer. With one last glance around her apartment, Maya grabbed her things and headed out the door. The airport was a whirlwind of activity as Maya made her way through the security checkpoint. She had done this 1,000 times before, but today felt different. Every step felt heavier, weighed down by the emotional burden she carried. As she moved through the crowded terminal, her thoughts kept drifting back to her mother. The look of disappointment in her eyes, the way their last conversation had ended in bitter silence. When Maya reached the gate for her first-class flight, she was met with an unexpected obstacle. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with cold, assessing eyes, scanned Maya from head to toe. Maya's casual travel attire and modest carry-on bag seemed to displease her. "This is the line for first class," the agent said, her voice laced with condescension. Maya blinked, momentarily taken aback by the tone. Years of FBI training had taught her to stay calm in tense situations, but this was different. This was personal. She felt the familiar burn of prejudice rising in her chest. "I'm aware," Maya replied evenly, pulling out her ticket and holding it up. The gate agent's eyes narrowed as she took the ticket, scrutinizing it as if it couldn't possibly be legitimate. "There must be a mistake," the agent said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Without warning, she waved over a security officer. Maya's stomach churned. The situation had escalated far too quickly. The officer approached, his hand resting casually on his belt as he assessed her. The whispers around her grew louder as more passengers turned to watch the scene unfold. Some even had their phones out, ready to record. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your ID," the officer said, his tone authoritative but calm. Maya felt a pang of frustration deep in her gut. She had been here before, too many times. The need to prove herself, to justify her presence in spaces where she belonged just as much as anyone else, was an all-too-familiar experience. She reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet, handing over her ID with a steady hand. But it wasn't the ID that would change things. Not today. With deliberate precision, Maya reached into her bag again and pulled out something that gleamed under the airport lights. Her FBI badge. The officer's eyes widened slightly, his confident posture deflating as he realized his mistake. The gate agent's face drained of color, her expression quickly shifting from smug superiority to flustered embarrassment. "I'm Special Agent Maya Henderson, FBI," Maya said, her voice steady and clear. The weight of those words hung in the air, silencing the whispers and stares around her. Suddenly, the entire atmosphere changed. The gate agent stumbled over her words, her earlier confidence shattered. I didn't realize. I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding," she stammered, handing back Maya's ticket with shaking hands. Maya accepted the ticket, her face an unreadable mask, but inside, a storm of emotions raged. She had faced this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. The sting of discrimination, of being judged for her appearance before anyone knew who she was, cut deep. As she boarded the plane, she couldn't help but think of her mother, of the countless times she had likely faced similar indignities. In that moment, Maya understood her mother's perspective in a way she never had before. She settled into her first-class seat, the leather cool against her skin, but she couldn't relax. The incident at the gate replayed in her mind over and over, mingling with memories of her mother's disapproving gaze. As the plane took off, Maya closed her eyes and leaned back, trying to steady her racing thoughts. This trip was about more than just a visit. It was about healing. And as she soared through the sky, Maya knew that the real journey, the one that mattered, was just beginning. Homecoming and confrontation. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, and Maya Henderson's heart skipped a beat. It had been years since she last set foot in her hometown, and the emotions swirling inside her were overwhelming. The familiar skyline outside the window triggered a flood of memories, some bittersweet, others painful. As the other passengers gathered their belongings, Maya remained seated for a moment, gripping the armrests as if to steady herself for the emotional storm that awaited her. When she finally stood up, Maya felt the weight of the impending confrontation with her mother pressing down on her. She grabbed her carry-on bag and made her way toward the exit, her steps deliberate and slow, as if part of her wanted to delay the inevitable. The airport buzzed with life, yet Maya felt strangely detached from it all, lost in her own thoughts. Outside, the summer heat hit her like a wall. The humid air clung to her skin as she stepped onto the curb and hailed a taxi. Her heart raced with every second that passed, the knot in her stomach tightening. She hadn't seen her mother in so long, and now the thought of their reunion brought an avalanche of conflicting emotions, guilt, anger, and a yearning for forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. Maya's phone buzzed again as she settled into the back seat of the cab. It was another message from Chris. "Hurry, Maya. She's not doing well." Maya's breath caught in her throat. Her mother's health had deteriorated quickly, and now it was a race against time. Her fingers shook as she typed back a quick reply, telling Chris she was on her way. The taxi pulled away from the airport, and Maya watched the city blur past her window. She hadn't been back here in years, and yet everything felt so familiar. The buildings, the streets, the people going about their daily lives, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes, trying to steel herself for what lay ahead. She thought about all the moments she had missed. Birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, each one a casualty of the rift between her and her mother. She had buried herself in work, using her career as an excuse to stay away. But now that excuse felt flimsy, even pathetic. She had let her pride come between them for too long, and now she was about to pay the price. The taxi pulled up in front of a modest suburban house, and Maya's heart sank. The place hadn't changed much. The small, weathered home still had the same peeling white paint, the same overgrown bushes in the front yard. It was as if time had stood still here, even as her own life had raced ahead in the fast lane. Maya took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Chris was waiting for her on the porch, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading evening light. He looked older than she remembered, with gray flecks in his beard and dark circles under his eyes. His expression was grim, but when he saw Maya, he managed a small, sad smile. "Maya," he said softly as she approached, pulling her into a tight hug. The weight of his embrace grounded her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this. They were in it together, like they always had been. "How is she?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris sighed and pulled back, looking down at the ground. "Not good. The doctors say it could be any day now." Maya swallowed hard, nodding as she tried to process the reality of what Chris was saying. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with years of missed conversations and unresolved tensions. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, the weight of the past pressing down on them both. Finally, Chris broke the silence. "She's been asking for you." Maya felt her throat tighten. She hadn't expected that. After everything that had happened between them, she had assumed her mother wouldn't want to see her, that she had written Maya off for good. The thought that her mother had been asking for her, even in her final days, sent a wave of emotion crashing over her. "I don't know if I'm ready," Maya admitted, her voice trembling. What if she doesn't want to forgive me? What if it's too late?" Chris placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "It's never too late, Maya. She's still your mom. No matter what happened between you, she loves you. You've got to try." Maya nodded, though her heart felt like it was about to shatter. She wasn't sure she could face her mother, not after all the hurt they had caused each other. But Chris was right. She had to try. With a deep breath, Maya followed her brother into the house. The inside of the house smelled like antiseptic and stale air, the unmistakable scent of illness and waiting. Maya hesitated at the threshold of her mother's bedroom, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear the steady beeping of medical equipment and the soft rustle of blankets. A nurse quietly exited the room, nodding respectfully as she passed by. Maya stepped inside, and there she was, her mother. The strong, formidable woman who had raised her was now a fragile figure lying in the bed, her once vibrant features sunken and pale. The sight of her like this was almost too much for Maya to bear. She stood frozen for a moment, her feet refusing to move. Chris gave her a reassuring nod and left her alone with their mother. Maya swallowed hard and stepped closer to the bed. Her mother's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and labored. The sound of the oxygen machine was rhythmic, but it filled the room with an eerie sense of finality. "Mama," Maya whispered, her voice cracking as she reached for her mother's hand. The skin was cool and papery, so unlike the strong hands that had once guided her through life. Tears welled up in Maya's eyes as she held onto her mother's hand, feeling the fragility of life slipping through her fingers. Her mother stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, her eyes were distant and clouded, as if she was looking through Maya rather than at her. But then something shifted and recognition dawned in her mother's eyes. Her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice weak but filled with emotion. "Maya, is that you?" Maya's throat tightened, and she had to swallow hard before she could speak. "Yes, Mama, it's me." Her mother's eyes softened, and for the first time in years, Maya saw a flicker of the warmth and love that had once defined their relationship. "I didn't think you'd come." Maya squeezed her mother's hand tighter, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Mama. I should have come sooner. I should have tried harder." Her mother closed her eyes for a moment, a deep sigh escaping her lips. When she opened them again, there was no anger, no bitterness, only sadness and regret. "We both should have, baby. But you're here now. That's all that matters." Maya let out a choked sob, the guilt and pain she had been carrying for so long finally breaking free. She knelt by the bed, resting her head against her mother's frail hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, "for everything." Her mother's hand weakly stroked Maya's hair, just like she had when Maya was a little girl. "I know, baby. I know." They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of their unspoken words finally lifting. There was no need for apologies anymore. In that moment, all that mattered was that they were together, even if it had taken them too long to get here. As the night deepened, Maya sat by her mother's side, holding her hand as the older woman drifted in and out of consciousness. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was both comforting and haunting. Every rise and fall of her mother's chest felt like a countdown, each breath a gift Maya wasn't sure how long would last. Chris returned, quietly joining her at their mother's bedside. Together, they watched over her, the silence between them now a comfort rather than a burden. They didn't need to speak. The years of tension and estrangement had begun to heal, slowly, painfully, but surely. As the moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, Maya looked at her mother's face and realized something. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Not an apology, not a grand gesture of forgiveness, but this simple, quiet moment of peace. For the first time in a long time, Maya felt like she had come home. The next morning, the hospital staff arrived, and the reality of the situation set in. Maya's mother was fading fast, and there wasn't much time left. Maya felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, knowing that they had said what needed to be said. There was still so much left unspoken, but in the end, it didn't matter. They had found each other again, even if only for a short time. As Maya and Chris stood by their mother's bed, holding her hands as she took her final breaths, Maya whispered softly, "I love you, Mama." And for the first time in years, Maya's mother smiled, a small, fragile smile that spoke of forgiveness, love, and peace. When the heart monitor finally fell silent, Maya knew that, in some way, they had both found what they were looking for. But the journey wasn't over. In fact, for Maya, it was just beginning. The weight of legacy. Maya stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching as the final clumps of dirt were carefully placed over her mother's casket. The sound was muffled by the soft breeze that swept through the trees, carrying with it the distant chirps of birds and the faint rustle of leaves. The funeral had been quiet, intimate, and brief, just as her mother had always preferred things. Maya's mind swirled with conflicting emotions, grief, regret, but also an unexpected sense of closure. As the last few mourners trickled away, offering her quiet condolences, Maya remained rooted in place, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Chris stood beside her, his face set in a somber expression as he stared at the grave, but Maya could tell that he, too, felt the weight of a complicated grief. Their mother was gone, and with her, the years of tension, the arguments, the misunderstandings. Yet there was also a profound emptiness where the chance for true reconciliation had once been. Maya felt the loss deeply, but underneath it all, there was something else, an undeniable sense of responsibility. Her mother had left behind a legacy, one that Maya had both embraced and rejected throughout her life. Now, standing in the shadow of her loss, Maya felt the full weight of that legacy bearing down on her. It had been just a week since her mother's passing, but already the world around Maya had shifted. The whirlwind of family, funeral arrangements, and well-wishers had kept her distracted for a while. But now, in the quiet of the cemetery, the reality of her life without her mother began to sink in. "I can't believe she's really gone," Chris murmured, breaking the long silence between them. Maya nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It still doesn't feel real." Chris glanced at her, his eyes filled with an understanding that only siblings who had weathered the same storm could share. He took a deep breath before speaking again, his voice laced with hesitation. "You know, she was proud of you. She didn't always show it, but she was." Maya felt a lump form in her throat. She never said it, she replied, her voice cracking slightly. I never knew. She didn't have to, Chris said softly. I saw it, in the way she talked about you when you weren't around. She kept clippings of your cases, Maya. Every news article, every story. She followed your career even when she couldn't bring herself to tell you. The words hit Maya like a wave. She had always assumed that her mother's silence meant disapproval, that her refusal to acknowledge Maya's work meant she didn't care. But hearing Chris's words now, it was as if a piece of the puzzle she had been missing for years finally fell into place. Her mother had loved her, had always loved her, despite their differences. Maya looked at her brother, tears brimming in her eyes. I should have tried harder, Chris. I should have. I don't know, done more to reach out. Chris shook his head, his expression firm but gentle. You did what you could, Maya. We both did. You can't carry all that guilt around. She knew you loved her. And she loved you too. That's enough. Maya wanted to believe him. But a part of her still ached with the regret of all the missed moments. She had spent so many years consumed by her work, trying to prove herself in a world that seemed determined to hold her back. But in doing so, she had distanced herself from the people who mattered most. And now, with her mother gone, there was no way to make up for that lost time. They stood there in silence for a few more moments before Chris finally placed a hand on her shoulder. You ready to go? Maya nodded, though her heart felt heavy. As they turned to leave, Maya cast one last glance at the grave, feeling a strange mix of grief and peace settle over her. Her mother's legacy wasn't just one of faith and tradition. It was also one of strength, resilience, and unwavering belief in standing up for what was right. And now, it was Maya's responsibility to carry that forward. Back at her apartment, Maya sat in the dim light of her living room, the hum of the city outside her window barely registering as her mind raced. The funeral had been a turning point, but now that it was over, Maya found herself at a crossroads. The life she had built, her career, her accomplishments, her battles, seemed to pale in comparison to the larger questions that loomed over her. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, the last conversation they had replaying on a loop. You're turning your back on us, Maya. On our people. At the time, Maya had thought she was doing the right thing. Joining the FBI had been her way of making a difference, of proving that justice could be served from within the system. But now, after years of facing discrimination, doubt, and systemic prejudice, Maya wasn't so sure anymore. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her supervisor at the FBI. Special Agent Ramirez. We need to talk. Important case. Maya stared at the message for a long time, her heart heavy with indecision. She had always prided herself on her work, on being the kind of agent who got things done no matter what. But lately, something had shifted. The airport incident had rattled her more than she wanted to admit, and her mother's passing had only deepened her doubts. She thought about the airline's promise to overhaul their racial bias training after the complaint she filed. It had felt like a small victory at the time, but now she realized how much bigger the fight was. The injustice she had experienced at the airport was just a symptom of a larger problem, a problem that ran deep, not just in society, but in the very institution she had spent her career serving. Maya knew what she had to do. She couldn't keep fighting these battles alone, one incident at a time. It was time to use her platform, her voice, to push for real, systemic change. With a renewed sense of purpose, Maya dialed Ramirez's number. He answered on the second ring. Henderson, glad you called back, Ramirez said. His tone was brisk, all business. Listen, we've got a high-priority case. I need you on it. Maya took a deep breath. Before we get into that, sir, I need to talk to you about something. There was a brief pause on the other end. Go ahead, Ramirez said, his tone cautious. I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the airport, Maya began, her voice steady but firm. About the way I was treated, the way people of color are treated every day. And not just by random gate agents, but by law enforcement, by institutions like ours. It's not enough for me to keep doing my job and hope things get better. I want to see real change, starting with us." Ramirez was silent for a moment, and Maya could hear the faint sound of papers rustling on his desk. "What are you suggesting?" "I want us to lead by example," Maya said, her resolve growing with each word. "We need mandatory, ongoing racial bias training for all agents, not just a one-off seminar. We need to review our policies, our recruitment practices, the way we handle cases involving marginalized communities, and I want to be part of that process." Another pause, longer this time. When Ramirez finally spoke, there was a note of approval in his voice. "I've been hearing similar concerns from other agents. You're not the only one who wants to see change. Let's set up a meeting, get the ball rolling on this. But it's going to take time." "I understand that," Maya said. "But I'm not going to sit back and wait for it to happen. I'm ready to lead the charge." Ramirez chuckled softly. "That's what I like about you, Henderson. You don't back down. I'll support you in this, but you know it's going to ruffle some feathers." "I'm not afraid of that," Maya replied. "It's too important." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, planning sessions, and strategy calls. Maya threw herself into the work, channeling her grief into a mission that felt larger than herself. The push for systemic change within the FBI wasn't easy, and as Ramirez had warned, it did ruffle feathers. But Maya's conviction never wavered. She had spent too long fighting to prove her worth. Now it was time to fight for something that could help others. Late one night, as Maya sat in her office, reviewing the first draft of the new racial bias training curriculum, she received an unexpected email. It was from Skyline Airlines, the company that had caused her so much grief during the airport incident. Subject: Progress Update on Anti-Bias Initiatives. Maya opened the email, her eyes scanning the carefully worded message. The airline had begun implementing the changes she had fought for. Mandatory training for all employees, a review of their hiring practices, and a public commitment to diversity and inclusion. They even invited Maya to be a part of their ongoing efforts as an external consultant. For the first time in what felt like months, Maya smiled, a real, genuine smile. She had turned a moment of humiliation into an opportunity for change, and now she was seeing the fruits of that labor. But it wasn't just about the airline. It was about the broader impact she was making, the legacy she was building. Her mother's legacy wasn't just one of family and faith. It was a legacy of strength, of resilience, of standing up for what was right. And now Maya was carrying that legacy forward, using her voice and her platform to make a difference. As she leaned back in her chair, Maya felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead was still long, and the fight for justice would never be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Maya felt ready. Ready to lead, ready to fight, ready to carry her mother's legacy into the future, one battle at a time. And she knew, deep down, that her mother would be proud. A battle beyond the badge. Weeks had passed since Maya Henderson spearheaded the push for systemic reform within the FBI. What had begun as a painful personal experience at the airport had evolved into something much larger, something more powerful. Maya was now leading a task force that wasn't just about racial bias training. It was about changing the very culture of the institution she had spent her life serving. Yet, as fulfilling as her work had become, it came with its own set of challenges, both inside and outside the bureau. Late one evening, Maya sat alone at her desk in the office, the quiet hum of the building around her offering a rare moment of calm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows on the walls. Stacks of case files and reform proposals were scattered across her desk, but Maya's focus was on something far more pressing. Her own sense of identity within an institution that, despite her best efforts, still felt reluctant to embrace change. The past few weeks had been filled with tense meetings, uncomfortable conversations, and a constant pushback from colleagues who saw her efforts as unnecessary or worse, a threat. Some agents, especially those who had spent decades in the bureau, viewed her call for reform as an indictment of their own practices. Others saw it as a challenge to the very foundation of law enforcement. And yet, for every voice of resistance, there was another agent who stood beside her, who understood the importance of what they were trying to accomplish. Those voices were what kept Maya going. She had seen too much injustice to remain silent. She had witnessed firsthand the impact that bias, both implicit and overt, had on the community she had sworn to protect. As she stared at the documents in front of her, Maya's phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her supervisor, Special Agent Ramirez. "Meet me in my office. Urgent." Maya's heart quickened. It wasn't like Ramirez to send messages like that without explanation. She quickly gathered her things and made her way down the hall, her mind racing with possibilities. As she approached Ramirez's office, she could hear voices inside, muffled but tense. She knocked lightly on the door before pushing it open. Inside, she found Ramirez seated behind his desk, his expression serious. Across from him sat two men Maya didn't recognize, both dressed in dark suits. Their faces were blank, unreadable, but there was something about their posture, the way they carried themselves, that put Maya on edge. "Henderson, come in," Ramirez said, gesturing for her to take a seat. Maya nodded and sat down, her gaze flicking between the two men as she waited for someone to speak. Ramirez cleared his throat. "Maya, this is Special Agent Dean and Director Wilson from the Office of Professional Responsibility. They're here to discuss an internal matter." Maya's stomach dropped. The Office of Professional Responsibility, or OPR, was responsible for investigating misconduct within the Bureau. The fact that they were here, in Ramirez's office, and looking at her, sent alarm bells ringing in her mind. "What's going on?" Maya asked, her voice steady, but laced with tension. Director Wilson leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "Agent Henderson, we've received some concerning reports regarding your recent activities, specifically your leadership of the Racial Bias Reform Task Force." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She had expected pushback, but she hadn't expected this. "What kind of reports?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Special Agent Dean spoke up, his tone cold and professional. "Several agents have expressed concerns that your efforts are undermining the Bureau's core mission. There have been allegations that you're creating division within the ranks, focusing too much on issues of race, and not enough on national security and criminal investigations." Maya felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. Division. Her efforts were about bringing people together, about addressing the biases that had gone unchallenged for too long. "With all due respect, sir," Maya said, keeping her voice calm despite the storm brewing inside her. "This task force was approved by the Bureau's leadership, including Director Ramirez. We're not undermining the mission. We're strengthening it by ensuring that we serve all communities fairly and without bias." Director Wilson nodded slowly, as if considering her words, but his expression remained neutral. "That may be the intention, Agent Henderson, but the perception within the Bureau is that your focus on reform is causing unrest. There are agents who feel that their integrity is being called into question simply because of the color of their skin or their years of service." Maya clenched her jaw. This was exactly the kind of resistance she had anticipated, but hearing it framed as unrest was infuriating. The very agents who were complaining about their integrity being questioned were the ones benefiting from a system that was biased in their favor. "I'm not questioning anyone's integrity," Maya said firmly. "I'm questioning the structures and systems that allow bias to go unchecked. We're talking about improving our practices, making sure we don't unintentionally harm the communities we're supposed to protect. If that's causing unrest, then maybe it's because the truth makes people uncomfortable." Ramirez glanced at Maya, a look of caution in his eyes. He knew this conversation was a delicate one. Director Wilson sighed. "Agent Henderson, we're not here to debate the merits of your task force. We're here because these concerns have reached the highest levels of the Bureau. There are those who believe that your leadership in this area is drawing too much attention that could be detrimental to your career." Maya's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting that I stop leading the task force? Wilson and Dean exchanged glances before Wilson spoke again. We're suggesting that you consider stepping back. Let someone else take over. Someone with more experience in these matters. Someone who can navigate the internal politics without creating friction. Maya stared at them, disbelief and frustration coursing through her. Step back. She had fought tooth and nail to get this task force off the ground, to push for meaningful reform, and now they wanted her to hand it over to someone else. Someone who would likely water down the very changes she was fighting for. I can't do that, Maya said, her voice low but resolute. I'm not stepping back. Not when there's so much at stake. I've worked too hard, and so have the other agents who support this reform. Dean's expression darkened. Agent Henderson, this isn't just about you. The Bureau has a larger mission, and we can't afford distractions. You need to think carefully about your next move. Maya felt the weight of their words pressing down on her, but she refused to be intimidated. This was about more than her career. This was about doing the right thing. I've made my decision, she said firmly. I'm staying on as the head of the task force. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Director Wilson stood up, smoothing his jacket as he prepared to leave. Very well, Agent Henderson. But understand this. The road ahead won't be easy. There are many within the Bureau who don't share your views, and they won't hesitate to make things difficult for you. I'm not afraid of difficult, Maya replied, standing her ground. I'm afraid of letting things stay the same. Without another word, Wilson and Dean left the office, leaving Maya and Ramirez alone in the tense aftermath of the meeting. Ramirez sighed, leaning back in his chair. You sure about this, Henderson? This could get messy. Maya met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. I've never been more sure of anything. Ramirez nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Good. Then let's get to work. Over the next few weeks, the tension within the Bureau became palpable. Maya's decision to stay on as the head of the task force had sent shockwaves through the ranks, and while many agents supported her, there were just as many who didn't. Whispers followed her in the hallways, and subtle acts of defiance began to surface. Missed meetings, ignored emails, and the occasional snide comment passed her way. It was clear that the opposition was growing, but Maya refused to back down. Her work became her armor. She threw herself into the task force, developing new training modules, gathering data on incidents of bias within the Bureau, and working with community leaders to understand how law enforcement could better serve marginalized groups. The task force met regularly, and Maya made sure that every voice was heard, every perspective valued. But outside the task force, things were getting more difficult. One afternoon, Maya arrived at her office to find a stack of case files that had mysteriously been misplaced for days. When she confronted the agent responsible, he shrugged and muttered something about being too busy to prioritize her requests. Another time, during a training session, one of the veteran agents openly questioned her authority, implying that her push for reform was nothing more than political posturing. Maya held her ground through it all, refusing to let the resistance shake her resolve. But as the weeks wore on, the pressure began to take its toll. She found herself working late into the night, her mind racing with the weight of it all. The work was exhausting, not just physically but emotionally. She knew that she was making progress, that change was happening, but the constant pushback made every victory feel like a hard-won battle. One night, as Maya sat in her office, her eyes bleary from staring at her computer screen, she received an email from a name she hadn't seen in years. Father Michael Jacobs. Maya's heart skipped a beat. Father Jacobs had been the pastor at the small church she and her mother used to attend when she was a child. He had always been a source of wisdom and guidance for their community, a man of quiet strength and unwavering faith. Maya hadn't spoken to him since she left for the FBI Academy. And now, seeing his name on her screen, a flood of memories came rushing back. She opened the email, her curiosity piqued. Subject: proud of you. Maya, I've been following your work from afar, and I just wanted to reach out and say how proud I am of what you're doing. I know it can't be easy, especially with the challenges you're facing, but you're standing up for what's right. Your mother would be so proud of you, too. Keep fighting the good fight, and know that we're all rooting for you here. With love and prayers, Father Michael Jacobs. Maya sat back in her chair, her eyes welling up with tears she hadn't realized she was holding back. The message was simple, but it hit her with the force of a tidal wave. In that moment, all the doubt, all the fear, all the exhaustion seemed to melt away. She thought of her mother, of the complicated, painful relationship they had shared, of the love that had always been there, even when it was unspoken. Her mother had fought her own battles, standing up for what she believed in, even when it put her at odds with the world around her. And now Maya was doing the same. She wiped away the tears and took a deep breath, a new sense of determination filling her chest. This fight was bigger than the whispers, bigger than the resistance from within the Bureau. It was about justice, about making sure that the next generation of agents didn't have to face the same biases, the same barriers. Maya opened her laptop and started drafting a new proposal, one that would go beyond just training. She wanted to see real, measurable outcomes. She wanted to track incidents of bias, hold agents accountable, and make sure that the Bureau's leadership was committed to seeing these changes through. As the night deepened and the city outside her window grew quiet, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep fighting. But the battle was far from over. As Maya prepared to take her reforms to the highest levels of the Bureau, she knew that the road ahead would be filled with more challenges, more resistance, and yet she wasn't afraid. She had her family's strength behind her, her community's support, and a growing sense of purpose that fueled her every move. The legacy of her mother, of resilience, of courage, of standing up for what was right, was now her legacy too. And Maya was ready to carry it forward, no matter what. The Bureau would change. The world would change. And Maya Henderson was determined to be at the center of that transformation, one battle at a time. Resistance and redemption. Maya Henderson stood at the window of her office, staring out over the city skyline as dusk settled in, casting long shadows over the streets below. The light outside faded, but the glow inside her office remained constant. Papers scattered across her desk, folders filled with notes from task force meetings, drafts of new policy proposals she had written late into the night. The work felt endless, but Maya welcomed it. It was her shield, her focus. Yet even as she threw herself into the mission, she could feel the tension around her building. Resistance was mounting, and it was becoming more personal. At first, it had been subtle. Agents missing meetings, ignoring her emails, and misplacing important case files related to her task force. Maya had shrugged it off, chalking it up to the usual pushback that came with any attempt to change the status quo. But lately, the resistance had become more overt, more organized. Whispers had spread through the halls, turning into full-blown rumors about Maya's motives. Some agents were openly accusing her of putting her own agenda ahead of the Bureau's priorities, claiming that her focus on racial bias was a distraction from the real work of law enforcement. Maya had heard it all. She knew there were those who believed she was compromising national security by focusing on social justice issues. Others thought she was trying to politicize the Bureau, turning it into a battleground for culture wars. The irony wasn't lost on her. For years, she had dedicated herself to upholding the law, to serving her country as an FBI agent, only to find herself accused of undermining it simply because she was fighting for justice in a way that made people uncomfortable. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Chris. "How are you holding up? I heard about the meeting with OPR. You okay?" Maya smiled softly at the text. Chris had been her rock through all of this, checking in on her constantly since their mother's passing. Even though he was busy with his own life, He had never wavered in his support for her. And after the tense meeting with the Office of Professional Responsibility, Maya had needed all the support she could get. She texted back, "I'm fine, just a lot on my plate, but I'm not backing down." A few moments later, his response came in. "I never thought you would. Mom wouldn't want you to. Proud of you. Sis. Keep going." Maya's smile widened slightly as she read the message. It was a simple reminder, but it was exactly what she needed. She wasn't fighting this battle alone. Her family was with her, in spirit if not always in person. She thought back to their mother's final days, to the quiet reconciliation they had found. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And now Maya carried that legacy with her, the strength, the resilience, the determination to stand up for what was right, no matter how hard it got. But even with that support, Maya knew that things were about to get harder. Much harder. The next morning, as Maya walked into the bureau, she could feel the tension in the air. It was thicker than usual, more palpable. As she passed by groups of agents, she noticed the hushed conversations, the sideways glances. Something was brewing, and Maya could sense it. When she reached her office, she found a thick envelope sitting on her desk, marked confidential. Her stomach twisted as she picked it up, already knowing what it was before she opened it. Inside were printed copies of several complaints that had been filed against her task force. The complaints were anonymous, but the language was clear, harsh, and damning. "Agent Henderson's focus on racial bias is a distraction from our mission. She's turning the Bureau into a political tool. Her task force is causing division and resentment among the ranks." Maya read through the complaints, her hands tightening around the edges of the paper. She had expected resistance, but seeing it laid out like this, formal, official, made it all the more real. These weren't just whispers in the hallway. These were agents actively working to undermine her efforts, and they were doing it under the guise of concern for the Bureau's mission. She dropped the papers on her desk, feeling the familiar sting of frustration rising in her chest. This was the battle she had been preparing for, but it didn't make it any easier to face. Before she could dwell on it, her office phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. "Henderson," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Maya, it's Ramirez. I need you in my office." There was a weight to his voice that made Maya's heart sink. Something was wrong, more than just the complaints. "I'll be right there," she said, already grabbing her jacket and heading for the door. When Maya entered Ramirez's office, she was met with a scene that made her stomach drop. Ramirez was seated at his desk, his usual calm demeanor replaced with something much more serious. Across from him sat 3 other senior agents, all of them with grim expressions. The air was thick with tension, and Maya immediately knew this wasn't just another meeting. "Henderson, close the door," Ramirez said, his voice low but firm. Maya did as she was told, then took a seat, her mind racing with possibilities. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. "What's going on?" Maya asked, trying to maintain her composure. Ramirez exchanged a glance with the other agents before speaking. "We've received word from some higher-ups that there are serious concerns about the impact your task force is having on the Bureau. The complaints have been piling up, and now it's reaching a boiling point." Maya clenched her fists under the table, her jaw tightening. "Complaints about what?" "About trying to make sure we're serving the public without bias. About trying to improve the way we interact with marginalized communities." One of the senior agents, a man named Agent Owens, leaned forward, his voice sharp. "That's not the issue, Henderson. The issue is how it's being perceived. There's a growing sense among the agents that you're more focused on social justice than on the Bureau's core mission: national security, criminal investigations. People are starting to question whether you're pushing a political agenda." Maya's eyes narrowed. "A political agenda? This isn't about politics. This is about making sure we don't let our own biases interfere with how we do our jobs. It's about making sure we're accountable to the communities we serve. Agent Owens shook his head. That's not how it's being seen. To a lot of agents, it feels like you're questioning their integrity, their professionalism. Ramirez raised a hand to stop the back and forth. Let's not turn this into an argument. Henderson, you know I support the work you're doing, but I have to be honest. This is starting to spiral out of control. We've had agents threatening to transfer out of your division, others refusing to work with you on cases. Morale is slipping, and it's putting pressure on leadership. Maya felt the blood drain from her face. The pushback was worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just resistance anymore. It was open defiance. And it wasn't just coming from a few disgruntled agents. This was widespread. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. So what are you saying? You want me to stop? To dismantle the task force? Ramirez sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. No, but we need to find a way to calm this down. We need to show the agents that this isn't about undermining them or their work. It's about making us better. But right now, that message isn't getting through. Maya leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew Ramirez was trying to help, but the reality was clear. The Bureau wasn't ready for the kind of change she was pushing for, and the more she fought for it, the more resistance she would face. But stepping back now, retreating in the face of this pressure, would mean letting the very people she was fighting for down. I'm not going to step back, Maya said, her voice resolute. But maybe we need to change how we're approaching this. Maybe we need to bring the agents into the conversation. Right now, they feel like they're being attacked. If we can make them part of the solution, maybe we can turn this around. Ramirez raised an eyebrow. How do you propose we do that? Maya thought for a moment. What if we held open forums, town hall-style meetings where agents can voice their concerns? We can address their fears directly, explain why this work is so important, and show them how it actually strengthens our mission, not weakens it. The other agents in the room exchanged glances, clearly unsure of the idea. Town halls. Owens scoffed. You really think a bunch of angry agents are going to sit around and have a polite conversation about this? Maya met his gaze, unflinching. If they don't, then they're not the professionals they claim to be. This isn't about making them feel good. It's about accountability. And it's about time we had this conversation, whether they like it or not. Ramirez nodded slowly, considering her words. It's risky, but it might be exactly what we need. If you're willing to take the lead on this, Henderson, I'll back you. Maya felt a surge of determination. I'm willing. Let's do it. In the weeks that followed, Maya and Ramirez organized a series of internal forums, inviting agents from all over the Bureau to participate. The meetings were tense, as expected, but they were also necessary. Maya stood in front of rooms filled with skeptical, sometimes hostile faces, but she never wavered. She answered questions, addressed concerns, and pushed back when needed. She refused to let the agents turn the conversation into a political debate, reminding them that the work of the FBI was about justice, about fairness, and about serving all Americans. There were difficult moments. Some agents stormed out of the meetings, unwilling to listen. Others argued that the focus on racial bias was a distraction from more pressing issues. But slowly, Maya began to see a shift. Not everyone was convinced, but some agents were beginning to see the bigger picture. They were starting to understand that addressing bias didn't mean attacking their integrity. It meant ensuring that they were doing their jobs to the best of their ability. After one particularly heated forum, an older agent approached Maya as the room cleared out. He had been one of the most vocal critics during the meeting, accusing her of undermining the Bureau's traditions. Henderson, he said, his voice gruff but measured. I still don't agree with everything you're doing, but I see where you're coming from, and I can respect that. Maya nodded, offering him a small, tired smile. I appreciate that. It's not about agreeing with me. It's about making sure we're all held to the same standard of accountability. The agent grunted in response, then turned to leave. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the forums continued, Maya noticed a subtle but significant shift in the atmosphere at the Bureau. The resistance hadn't disappeared entirely, but the open hostility had lessened. More agents were willing to engage in the conversation, to listen, to consider the changes that were being proposed. One afternoon, as Maya was leaving the Bureau after another long day of meetings, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Skyline Airlines. Subject: Congratulations. Maya opened the email and smiled as she read the words. The airline had officially launched its new racial bias training program, and the feedback from employees had been overwhelmingly positive. They thanked Maya for her role in pushing them to do better, and they even invited her to speak at an upcoming conference on diversity and inclusion in the corporate world. For the first time in months, Maya felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had fought for this, and now she was seeing the results. But it wasn't just about the airline. It was about the work she was doing within the FBI. The battle wasn't over, but Maya knew she was making progress, one step at a time. She thought about her mother, about the legacy of strength and resilience that had been passed down to her. And she realized that, in her own way, she was honoring that legacy by continuing the fight. The road ahead was still long, still filled with obstacles, but for the first time in a long time, Maya felt hopeful. She wasn't just pushing for reform, she was pushing for redemption. For herself, for the Bureau, for the communities that had been overlooked for far too long. And she wasn't going to stop. As she walked out of the building and into the warm evening air, Maya looked up at the sky, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. This was the beginning of something bigger, something more profound than she had ever imagined. And she was ready to see it through, no matter what it took. Because for Maya Henderson, the fight was never just about today. It was about the future we fight for. The next few months were a whirlwind of change, resistance, and hard-won victories. Maya Henderson had become a force to be reckoned with inside the FBI, not just for her work on the Racial Bias Task Force, but for her unyielding determination to push the Bureau toward a more just future. The town halls, which had started off as tense and divisive, were now turning into constructive, if still uncomfortable, discussions. More agents were beginning to see the value in the reforms Maya was advocating for, and slowly the walls of resistance were coming down. But change, especially systemic change, is never easy. For every step forward, there were still those who tried to pull Maya back. Anonymous complaints continued to filter through the system, and a small but vocal group of agents remained adamantly opposed to the direction she was leading the Bureau. Some even went so far as to question her loyalty, implying that her focus on racial justice meant she wasn't committed to the Bureau's primary mission of national security. It was exhausting, mentally, physically, emotionally. But Maya had come too far to turn back now. One crisp fall morning, as Maya arrived at the Bureau, she was met with a familiar sense of anticipation and unease. Today was a big day, the culmination of months of hard work. The Bureau's leadership, along with key community figures, had agreed to a public forum where the results of the task force's work would be unveiled. It was Maya's chance to show that change was not only possible but necessary. It was also her chance to prove that the FBI could evolve and grow without sacrificing its core mission. She stood in front of the mirror in the Bureau's restroom, adjusting the collar of her blazer and taking a deep breath. Her reflection stared back at her, a face hardened by months of battles fought behind closed doors, but also one that carried the quiet strength of purpose. The weight of responsibility was heavy on her shoulders, but Maya knew it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the agents who believed in her, the communities who had placed their trust in the Bureau, and the memory of her mother, whose legacy of resilience and justice had propelled her forward. As she left the restroom, she spotted Special Agent Ramirez waiting for her by the elevators. He offered her a small, encouraging smile, but Maya could see the tension behind his eyes. Today wasn't just important for her. It was important for the Bureau's reputation, for its future. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice low but filled with genuine concern. Maya nodded. I have to be. Ramirez stepped into the elevator with her, the two of them standing in silence as the doors closed. As they ascended to the top floor, Maya mentally rehearsed her talking points, her responses to the inevitable pushback she knew was coming. This wasn't just about showcasing the task force's work, it was about defending the very idea of reform. She had to prove that what they were doing wasn't a distraction, but a necessary step forward. When the elevator doors opened, Maya and Ramirez were greeted by a flurry of activity. Agents, community leaders, and media representatives filled the large conference room. The atmosphere buzzed with a mixture of excitement and tension. Maya could feel the weight of expectation hanging in the air. At the front of the room, a long table had been set up with microphones and nameplates for the speakers. Maya's name was at the center, flanked by Ramirez and several senior officials. The sight of it filled her with a sense of purpose. This was her moment. This was the culmination of everything she had worked for, not just in the past few months, but throughout her career. As she took her seat, the room quieted. All eyes were on her. Ramirez leaned over, his voice barely a whisper. Just remember, you've earned this. No matter what happens, you've already made a difference. Maya nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, as the meeting was called to order. The first few minutes were filled with formalities, introductions, acknowledgments of the work the Bureau had done over the years. But soon enough, the focus shifted to Maya and her task force. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she prepared to speak. Her mind flashed back to all the battles she had fought to get here. The defiant agents, the anonymous complaints, the endless meetings where she had to justify why this work mattered. And of course, the personal battles. The guilt she had carried over her relationship with her mother, the loneliness that came with standing up for what was right. But now, as she looked out over the crowd, Maya felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for something much bigger. She leaned into the microphone, her voice clear and strong. Thank you for being here today. I want to start by acknowledging that the work we've been doing, examining our biases, reforming our practices, isn't easy. But it's necessary. For too long, we've relied on systems that don't serve all Americans equally. It's time for that to change. There was a murmur in the crowd, but Maya pressed on. This task force wasn't created to criticize or diminish the work we do as law enforcement officers. It was created to ensure that we live up to the values we claim to represent: justice, fairness, and accountability. Maya paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. We've developed new training modules that will not only educate our agents on racial bias, but also provide practical tools for identifying and addressing those biases in the field. We've worked with community leaders to ensure that our reforms reflect the needs of the people we serve, not just the priorities of the institution. And we've put in place a system of accountability, so that when mistakes are made, they're addressed swiftly and transparently. She glanced at Ramirez, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. The truth is, Maya continued, we can't ignore the fact that trust in law enforcement has eroded in many communities, especially communities of color. But it doesn't have to stay that way. We can rebuild that trust. We can show that the FBI is committed to serving all Americans, regardless of race, ethnicity, or background. The room was silent now, the murmurs from earlier gone. Maya could feel the tension building as she approached the crux of her message. This isn't about politics, she said, her voice firm. It's about justice, and justice should never be a partisan issue. It should be something we all strive for, no matter who we are or where we come from. And as FBI agents, it is our duty to ensure that we uphold those values every single day. Maya sat back slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had said what needed to be said. Now she just had to wait for the response. The first question came from an older agent seated in the back. His face was lined with years of experience, and his voice carried the weight of skepticism. Agent Henderson, How do you respond to those who say this focus on racial bias is taking us away from more pressing issues, like national security and counterterrorism? Maya didn't hesitate. I understand those concerns, but I don't believe this work is taking us away from our core mission. In fact, it strengthens it. Our ability to effectively protect this country relies on the trust of the American people. If there are communities that don't feel safe working with law enforcement, we lose valuable allies in our fight against crime and terrorism. Addressing bias isn't a distraction. It's a critical part of doing our jobs better. The agent nodded slowly, his expression softening as he considered her words. Another question came, this time from a young black woman sitting with a group of community leaders. How will you ensure that these reforms don't just become a checkbox exercise? How do we know this is real and not just for show? Maya smiled, grateful for the question. That's a fair concern. Too often, we see reforms announced with fanfare, only to have them fizzle out once the media attention fades. But we're committed to making sure that doesn't happen here. We've put in place systems to track our progress, data on incidents of bias, evaluations of our training programs, and feedback from the communities we serve. And most importantly, we're holding ourselves accountable. This task force isn't going anywhere. We're here to stay. The woman nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. As the forum continued, Maya fielded more questions, some tough, some supportive, but she never faltered. She was speaking from a place of conviction, and it showed. By the time the event was over, the mood in the room had shifted. What had started as a tense, uncertain gathering had turned into something else, something hopeful. As the crowd began to disperse, Maya felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Ramirez standing beside her, a small but genuine smile on his face. "You did good, Henderson," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Really good." Maya smiled back, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. "Thanks, Ramirez. I couldn't have done it without your support." Ramirez shrugged. "You could have done it without me, but I'm glad I was here to see it." Later that evening, Maya found herself back in her apartment, sitting on the couch and staring out the window at the city lights. The adrenaline from the day had finally worn off, leaving her feeling exhausted but fulfilled. She had done it. She had stood her ground, pushed for change, and made real progress. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a long time, Maya felt like they were moving in the right direction. Her phone buzzed beside her, and she picked it up, expecting another message from Chris or Ramirez. But when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. Father Michael Jacobs. She opened the message, her hands trembling slightly. "Maya, I watched the forum today. I just wanted to say how proud I am of you. Your mother would be too. You're doing exactly what you were meant to do. Keep going, my child. The world needs more people like you." Maya sat back, tears filling her eyes as she read the words over and over again. Her mother. It had been months since she had passed, but the wound still felt fresh. And yet, in that moment, Maya could almost feel her presence, quiet, steady, and full of love. She wiped her tears and looked out at the skyline, the weight of the day settling over her. There was still so much work to be done, so many battles yet to be fought. But for the first time, Maya knew, really knew, that she wasn't alone in this fight. She had her family, her colleagues, her community, and most importantly, herself. She stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The future wasn't just something to be feared, it was something to be fought for. And Maya Henderson was ready to lead that fight, no matter what came next. Because in the end, the future wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. It was about redemption. It was about hope. And Maya was ready to embrace it with everything she had.